I knew something was off the moment I saw a guy relieving himself in my driveway. He wasn't even trying to hide it, just casually talking on the phone like my property was a public restroom. Nearby, another man rummaged through a cooler in the back of his SUV, having the time of his life under the shelter of my covered entryway. It was like I'd walked onto the wrong set of a backyard barbecue reality show, except it was my house, my driveway, and my tools sitting exposed in the rain because I couldn't even reach my garage. Somehow, without permission or notice, my home had been repurposed into overflow parking for the HOA president's backyard mixer. There were 3 cars lined up like they'd been assigned. Organized. Coordinated. It wasn't a spontaneous crowd, it was a quiet takeover. When I knocked on Nain Whitlow's door, I skipped the usual neighborly pleasantries. I was already soaked, and I just jogged through the rain after hauling tile and stone samples inside by hand. Because, again, my driveway was barricaded. Nain answered in a flowing floral dress, white wine in hand, looking like a lifestyle magazine ad for summer in the suburbs. Her expression lit up when she saw me, eyes wide, smile warm, but it felt like someone flipping on stage lights. All performance. "Oh, Mason," she said with faux surprise and practiced grace, her voice just loud enough for the people inside to hear. Behind her, I could see guests laughing, glasses clinking, music floating out into the night like it had been choreographed to drown out complaints. "Hi, Nain," I said evenly, already calculating how many of her garden bricks I could scatter across her lawn before I got arrested. "I need those cars moved from my driveway immediately. I've got tile and materials in my truck that can't sit in the rain overnight, and I can't even pull into my garage." She took a slow sip of wine and tilted her head. "Oh, I completely understand your frustration," she said, enunciating frustration like it was a toddler's tantrum. "But this is our first Community Connection Saturday. It's important for neighbors to come together, and your driveway is just so convenient. Translation: your property is my annex. Deal with it." I stayed calm. "Look, I get the spirit of community, but this is my home. I have valuable materials in the back of my truck. I can't just let them sit out." She smiled wider, eyes glinting. "It's only a few hours. Surely someone as capable as you can find a creative solution that doesn't spoil everyone's evening." Capable? Maybe. But also done playing nice. I trudged back through the rain, parked my truck 3 blocks away, and spent the next 40 minutes hauling heavy boxes in wet clothes while her guests laughed under string lights and stayed dry on my porch. What got to me wasn't just the aching back or soaked clothes. It was how perfectly calculated it all felt. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just smiled, made it sound like I was the problem, and quietly co-opted my property for her agenda. The next morning, I opened my inbox and found an email from the Maple Street HOA. Subject line: exciting summer community event schedule. It was signed by Nain, naturally, and buried in the body was the line that made my stomach drop. "During our weekly Saturday mixes, select properties will support overflow parking for guests. Thank you for being part of building a stronger neighborhood." I read it twice. Then again. There was my address, listed as one of the designated community access points, aka parking lot. This wasn't a one-time inconvenience. It was a coordinated hijacking, dressed in pastels and sugar-coated with buzzwords like connection, neighborly, and shared responsibility. She hadn't just crossed the line. She'd paved a new road across it and invited the entire HOA to walk it in heels with wine glasses. But the kicker? That first official Community Saturday arrived exactly a week later. I parked my truck early, in the garage, and waited. By 6 p.m., 5 vehicles were parked across my driveway like it had been reserved. A wall of bumpers sealed me in. No access to the street. No access to my garage. No access to my life. And right then, I needed that access more than ever. At 7:30 p.m., I had a meeting scheduled with a potential client, a $15,000 backyard renovation deal. Custom patio. Fire pit. Materials already pulled and ready to present. Drawings laid out in my workshop. It was going to be a game changer. But now, my materials were 20 feet away, behind a blockade of party guests' vehicles. I tried calling Nain, but she didn't pick up. Probably too busy networking over sangria. I stared out the window at my driveway-turned parking lot as my phone buzzed. The client was 5 minutes out. I paced. Debated. Then called him. "Hey, really sorry," I said, watching a man in boat shoes pull a beer from the cooler that was still perched under my awning. "I'm having an unexpected issue getting into my garage tonight. Would it be okay to reschedule?" There was a pause. This is kind of a one-window deal for me, Mason. I rearranged a lot for this. If we can't do it tonight. I watched my $15,000 opportunity evaporate like steam off the wet pavement. Click. I sat down at my kitchen table, soaked in silence and the fading echoes of laughter from Nain's yard. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at my ceiling, already planning my next move. Because this wasn't just rudeness. It was war. I reviewed the HOA bylaws. Reread every community regulation. Found a clause about property use boundaries and guest parking policies that clearly contradicted Nain's overflow designation. I contacted a friend who works in local zoning and another who's a real estate lawyer. By the end of the week, I'd filed a formal complaint with the city and sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA board, citing trespassing, obstruction of property, and unapproved repurposing of private land. Then I posted everything: photos of the blocked driveway, partygoers on my porch, screenshots of the email, and a short video of the guy using my driveway as a urinal, on the local neighborhood forum. The thread exploded. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. Others had dealt with Nain's community spirit before: shrubs trimmed without permission, letters about lawn heights, fines for invisible cracks in sidewalks. My post was the match that lit the fire. Within a month, the HOA board held a vote to revise party regulations and revoke unauthorized overflow parking zones. Nain voted no, of course. But she was outnumbered. The Saturday mixers stopped. My driveway stayed clear. And while the $15,000 job was gone, a different kind of payoff arrived in the form of 3 new client referrals, courtesy of neighbors who saw my post and appreciated that someone finally stood up to the HOA queen. The best part? Every time I saw Nain after that, she smiled a little tighter, waved a little quicker, and kept her wine parties well inside her own fence. Because now she knew what I'd known all along. You don't steal a man's driveway and expect him to stay parked. My hands weren't shaking from anger anymore. Not entirely. It was something colder, heavier. The sick weight of knowing that $15,000 had slipped through my fingers, not because of market forces or poor planning, but because my own HOA president had co-opted my driveway for her personal social calendar. I stared out the window at the last of her guests. Laughing in the drizzle, their glasses raised like they were toasting a job well done. And in a way, they were. I sat motionless in my kitchen, wet clothes clinging to me, the floor beneath my boots still damp from hours of shuttling stone and tile from the street. My muscles ached, my back throbbed, and my pride felt hollowed out. But more than the physical toll, something had shifted deep inside me. This wasn't about convenience anymore. This wasn't even about respect. This was about interference. Systematic, calculated interference. Nain wasn't just throwing parties, she was sabotaging my ability to operate my business from my own home. And she was doing it with such polished composure that the neighborhood clapped for her while I got treated like a cranky shut-in. The loss of that job felt like a gut punch, but it also clarified things. I stepped outside into the cool evening air and took my phone out, fingers still slick with rain. I started taking pictures, one car after another, neatly lined up across my driveway like chess pieces. I made sure to get the license plates. I made sure the timestamps were clear. Then I went back inside, to my computer, and wrote the most professional, sterile email I could possibly compose. No emotion. No heat. Just facts, documented clearly and dispassionately. I attached the photos. I included the HOA bylaws that pertain to property access, parking, and use of private space. I cited the lost income, without drama, just numbers. I CC'd the HOA board members. I double-checked every line for tone. If she wanted a war of appearances, I was done playing amateur hour. Nain's response came less than 2 hours later. I knew it would. She couldn't resist the opportunity. Her email was a masterclass in subtle character assassination. She didn't respond to my documentation. She didn't deny the facts. She reframed them. I can certainly understand how stressful it must be to feel inconvenienced by community activities, she began. But perhaps the stress you're experiencing is related to work pressures. I do hope you're taking care of your well-being. It wasn't a reply. It was a diagnostic report. She took my legitimate complaint about repeated trespassing and property obstruction, and reframed it as a mental health concern. Not her failure to respect property lines, my inability to cope. I sat back in my chair and reread the message twice. The tone was perfect, warm, concerned, utterly infuriating. It was like being strangled with silk ribbons. Every word soft enough to pass inspection, every sentence sharpened like a scalpel. I closed my laptop. Then I reached for a hammer. Not to smash anything. Not yet. Just to build. By the next morning, 2 small wooden posts stood at the entrance of my driveway. Clean, simple signs. White backgrounds. Black lettering. Private property. They were modest, regulation compliant, and clearly marked. I triple-checked the HOA guidelines before putting them up. I knew exactly how tall they could be, where they had to be placed, and what language they could include. They didn't threaten. They didn't accuse. They just defined. It wasn't just a line in the sand. It was a legal boundary. And a dare. The violation notice landed in my inbox by dinner. Timestamp, 6:47 p.m. That meant she'd seen the signs, drafted a formal citation, and filed it with the HOA board, all before most people had finished their evening meals. It wasn't just enforcement. It was a message, I see you. And I'm still in control. The notice was slick and official. She'd cited obscure aesthetic guidelines about unapproved modifications visible from the street and non-standard signage. The fine? $100. Payable in 30 days. With an added $25 for every day the violation remained uncorrected. It wasn't about the money. It was the speed. She hadn't seen a violation during a casual walk. She'd been watching. Actively. Waiting for me to make a move so she could slap it down with legal precision. The kind of thing you only do if you've had practice. I stood outside that evening and looked at my signs, modest, tasteful, unthreatening. Then I looked across the street to where Nain stood in her kitchen, gesturing animatedly into her phone. She didn't need to gloat. The HOA logo on the notice was her smirk. The second Community Connection Saturday arrived like a slow-moving hurricane. I'd removed the signs, not because I believed they were out of line, but because I was tired of feeding her a reason to find me. I'd surrendered an inch, thinking maybe it would buy me peace. It didn't. By 5:30 p.m., the invasion had begun. 8 cars this time. A full fleet. My driveway looked like a dealership lot. And Nain wasn't hiding it anymore, she was directing traffic from my sidewalk like she owned it. Pointing. Smiling. Waving people forward. One guest's kid spilled juice on my walkway while another's dog tore through my front yard mulch like it was a racetrack. I watched, helpless, as my home was converted into the lobby of her country club. By 6 p.m., I was officially trapped. Couldn't leave if I wanted to. The cars had boxed me in, bumper to bumper from garage door to street. I held a brick in my hand, fingers curling around it like it was a stress ball. For a moment, I imagined the arc it would travel if I threw it through her champagne flute. Instead, I put the brick down. And picked up the phone. At 7 o'clock sharp, I dialed the non-emergency police line. I kept my voice calm. Clear. Respectful. I explained everything, the parking, the obstruction, the lost income, the retaliation for signage. They said they'd send someone by. The officer arrived 20 minutes later. Middle-aged. Polite. Professional. I stepped outside, ready to walk him through everything with photos and email chains to back me up. I didn't get the chance. Nain appeared the moment his boot hit my driveway. Smiling. That perfect warm tone dialed to 11. Officer. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I'm Nain Whitlow, the HOA president. I've actually been a little concerned about Mason lately. She turned to me, soft eyes full of performance. He's been under so much pressure with his business lately, and I think these events might be triggering some anxiety. It's just been a lot for him. It was masterful. A switchblade smile wrapped in concern. I watched the officer glance between us, recalibrating the scene in real time. One of us looked relaxed, cheerful, with community backing and a title. The other, wet, furious, tense, looked like he was about to lose it over some parked cars. 15 minutes later, he left. No citations. No enforcement. Just a reminder to try and work things out with your neighbors. I stood in the rain as his tail lights disappeared, and something clicked in me. She'd won every civil round. Every rational appeal, every documented complaint. She could twist any scenario into a wellness check on me. She wasn't just good at this. She was practiced. But what she didn't know, what she'd never imagined, was that she'd just escalated this with someone who knew how to build a counterattack. I didn't pick up the brick. I picked up my phone. By midnight, I'd made every call I needed. I had the gear. I had the crew. I had a plan so surgically clean, it could have passed as a city contract. She'd stolen my driveway for 2 weekends. Now I was going to take hers. At 8 a.m. Sunday morning, I walked into the local permit office. Forms in hand. Every line filled, every spec calculated. I submitted my application for a landscape renovation project. The clerk at the desk smiled as she reviewed the paperwork. "A new brick patio," she said, scanning the layout. "That herringbone pattern's going to look beautiful." I nodded and tucked the approved permit into my jacket like a loaded weapon. Friday night, I made the final call to my crew chief. "We start after sunset," I said. "Full crew, full gear. Straight through the night. No trace by sunrise." He didn't ask questions. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. Birds chirping. Neighbors trimming hedges. Across the street, Nain's backyard bustled with preparation. Folding chairs, tiki torches, buffet tables, even a portable margarita station. She was clearly gearing up for her grandest event yet. And she had no idea what was about to happen next. Saturday night, when I was certain that Nain's party had hit full volume, I gave my crew chief the nod. No words were exchanged, just a simple hand gesture. That was all it took. Within minutes, my crew rolled in like shadows, silent and deliberate, each member moving with the kind of unspoken coordination that comes from years of shared work. No headlights. No music. Just the hum of machinery and the glow of portable floodlights casting long shadows across the front yard. This wasn't just construction. This was ritual. We began by removing the concrete driveway piece by piece. The dull thud of chisels, the scrape of metal on stone, and the occasional mechanical hiss were the only sounds that accompanied us. My crew didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They had done dozens of jobs like this, but never one with this much personal weight. We were transforming a passive surface into a statement of finality. And make no mistake, it wasn't a renovation. It was a declaration. A quiet, irreversible middle finger to the woman who thought she could erase my boundaries with a smile and a party invitation. Once the old concrete was gone, we started on the brickwork. Herringbone pattern, classic, tight, and deliberate. Every brick placed with surgical precision, each one interlocking with its neighbors like a vow, never again. We worked through the night, only pausing for water and brief stretches. Even fatigue felt like part of the ceremony. The kind of satisfaction that came not from revenge, but from control reclaimed. By the time the first rays of sunlight lit the rooftops of Maple Street, my driveway had been completely reborn. It looked like the entrance to a high-end estate. Elegant. Restrained. Impossibly precise. The herringbone design created subtle depth and motion. The decorative border defined the space like a frame around a portrait. It didn't just look professional, it looked intentional, like it had been crafted by a team of landscape architects with a generous budget and no deadline. But the beauty was only half the story. Functionally, it was perfect. The new surface sat 6 inches higher than the original grade. On either side, we installed decorative planters that doubled as physical barriers. The plants were hardy perennials, low maintenance, evergreen, and thick enough to make sure no tire could ever mount the edge without consequences. There was now no possible way for any vehicle to use my driveway as overflow parking, even for 5 minutes. When I sat on my porch that morning, fresh coffee in hand, I felt no guilt. Just quiet satisfaction. I watched the sunlight hit the freshly laid bricks, the red and brown tones glowing like embers. Steam drifted up from my mug. The neighborhood was still asleep, except for the birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the hedges. And then, right on schedule, the door across the street opened. Nain stepped out, hair pulled up in a casual bun, holding a garbage bag in one hand. She wore athletic leggings and an oversized sweatshirt with a cheerful slogan printed across the front. From the way she walked, casual, relaxed, I could tell she hadn't noticed anything yet. She was expecting the same old concrete slab that had enabled her to treat my property like it was hers. She took 3 confident steps forward. Then she saw it. She froze mid-stride, like someone had yanked an invisible chain. Her body swayed slightly, off balance, and for a second I thought she might actually fall forward. Her face contorted in slow motion, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, the dawning horror of realization. Her precious unofficial parking lot was gone. Replaced by a professionally designed surface that screamed, "Not yours. Not ever again." The moment stretched out deliciously. She blinked, then took a step back. Looked again. Tilted her head. Like she was trying to convince herself it wasn't real. I sipped my coffee, savoring the aroma and the silence. That expression, stunned, cornered, defeated, was worth every brick. By Sunday evening, word had spread. By Monday, I'd received 3 passive-aggressive emails from HOA board members asking about the alterations to my property and whether proper architectural review procedures had been followed. And by Tuesday, there was a meeting. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m., held at the Maple Street Community Center. The subject line of the email read, "Urgent Community Meeting, Harmony Under Threat." At first glance, it sounded like something out of a bad thriller. For a split second, I thought there had been a robbery or a fire. Harmony under threat? Apparently, beautifying my own property had triggered a full-blown crisis. The body of the email was a masterpiece of weaponized civility. "Dear Maple Street neighbors," it began. "We need to address a serious situation that threatens the harmony and cooperation that makes our community such a wonderful place to live." The language was so carefully constructed, it took 3 reads to see what it was actually saying. I wasn't being invited, I was being indicted. I showed up anyway. The room was already full when I walked in. Folding chairs packed into tight rows. Every neighbor I barely recognized sat in judgmental silence, their heads turning like sunflowers to follow me as I walked to the back. Conversations dipped to whispers. Chairs shifted. People made space, but not out of politeness. It felt more like a ritual distancing, as if proximity to me might be contagious. Nobody said my name, but I could feel it in the room like smoke. Nain opened the meeting with her usual warm smile and carefully measured tone. She thanked everyone for coming on such short notice and emphasized how important it was to preserve community values during times of change. It was 10 minutes of lavender-scented nothing. No facts. No names. Just carefully curated concern. She talked about aggressive actions, unilateral changes, and the breakdown of shared space values. Her performance was flawless. The audience nodded along. One neighbor praised the spirit of the potlucks. Another warned against factions. Not a single person brought up how I hadn't been able to access my driveway for weeks. Not one acknowledged that I had followed every protocol until I was forced to take matters into my own hands. I was being portrayed as some kind of antisocial vandal who'd responded to a neighborhood party with a scorched earth policy. And then, just when I thought I might have to stand and defend myself, Eleanor Hatch stood up. Eleanor was 72 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with a voice that could silence a room full of children. She had lived on Maple Street longer than most of the houses had been painted. When she spoke, everyone listened. "I appreciate everyone's concern about neighborhood harmony," she began, her voice calm and clear. "But I think we need to be honest about what's really happening here, and what's happened before." Every head turned. Every breath held. She looked directly at Nain, her expression composed but firm. "Nain, you've done admirable work as our HOA president in many ways. But this situation with Mason's driveway reminds me of what happened with the Millers." A ripple of memory moved through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably. The Millers, yes, the family that used to live in the Johnsons' house. The ones who'd left suddenly, under circumstances no one really wanted to talk about. Eleanor continued, voice unwavering. "They got violations for everything: fence color, mailbox placement, even the height of their garden borders. Constant fines. Constant pressure. They tried to cooperate. But eventually, they felt so targeted that they sold their home for below market value, just to get away." I watched Nain's face. Her smile didn't fade. It simply froze. Eleanor let the silence settle before delivering her final point. "I always wondered if that outcome wasn't just an accident. And now, watching what's happening to Mason, I'm seeing the same pattern." The silence that followed was thick. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Nain tried to recover. She called the Miller case regrettable, and said the HOA had only enforced rules equally. She claimed that Eleanor might be misremembering details, and insisted that comparing the 2 cases wasn't fair. But something had changed. Her voice no longer carried the same conviction. Her confidence faltered. No vote was held that night. No formal verdict issued. But doubt had entered the room. And it wasn't leaving. As the last of the neighbors trickled out of the community center, the hum of whispered conversations lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. I didn't have to strain to catch fragments. Questions about the Miller family floated on the breeze, carried by wary glances and hushed tones. "Did you know about that before tonight?" someone asked near the door. "If it's true, why didn't the board say something sooner?" another voice replied. The atmosphere, once filled with the routine pleasantries of a neighborhood gathering, now crackled with uncertainty and suspicion. Near the entrance, Nain lingered, making a conspicuous effort to speak with everyone leaving. Normally, her practiced charm drew people in, like moths to a porch light. Tonight, it flickered. Her usual warm tone was brittle, her smile too fixed. Several residents gave her curt nods or mumbled excuses before heading out. No one lingered to laugh at her jokes. She could feel it. The mask was cracking. I was nearly to my car when I heard quick footsteps behind me. "Mason," a soft voice called. I turned to see Eleanor, her expression unreadable in the low light. She glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "I think you should know," she began, her voice low and urgent. "Nain hasn't been entirely honest tonight. The situation with the Millers was far worse than she let on, and I have documentation, records, letters, notes, of what really happened." She handed me a business card. Her contact information was handwritten on the back, in precise, tidy script. "Call me tomorrow evening," she said. "If this gets worse, and I believe it will, you'll want to know what you're really dealing with." I tucked the card into my wallet, feeling the faintest tremor of dread. 3 days later, that tremor became a quake. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a man in a blazer too sharp for postal work. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, embossed with the name of Henderson and Associates, the most notorious, high-powered real estate law firm in the county. My hand went cold just holding it. The moment I saw the return address, I knew. This wasn't a warning shot. It was a declaration of war. Inside were 12 pages of dense legal language dressed to impress and sharpened to wound. Every sentence was polished like a weapon. The heart of it? An accusation that chilled me to the bone. According to the HOA, via their elite legal enforcers, my recent overnight brick driveway renovation was an unauthorized structural modification that had adversely affected neighborhood property values and violated multiple provisions of the community's covenants and restrictions. I kept reading. The next few pages demanded immediate remediation. I was to remove the brick entirely, restore the driveway to its original concrete state, and pay financial damages to nearby homeowners for the alleged impact on their property values. But it was a sentence on page 8 that made my vision blur. In the event that the defendant fails to comply with court-ordered remediation within 60 days of final judgment, the Maple Street Homeowners Association reserves the right to place a lien against the property at 123 Maple Street, and to initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover all associated costs and penalties. They weren't just demanding I rip up my driveway. They were threatening to take my house. I sat in silence, the letter trembling in my hands. It wasn't about bricks or bylaws anymore. It was about power. And control. The next morning, I called my home insurance company to ask about coverage for HOA-related legal disputes. The silence on the other end told me what I needed to know. Then came 2 agonizing hours with a lawyer who specialized in HOA defense. His advice was blunt and devastating. Even if I won the case, my savings wouldn't survive. "These lawsuits can take months, sometimes years," he said. "Tens of thousands in legal fees, expert witnesses, court filings. They weigh you down until you settle or sell." That evening, I finally dialed Eleanor's number. "Can I come over?" I asked. "I need to hear the full story." Eleanor lived in a warm, inviting craftsman bungalow just a few blocks away. Her living room was filled with bookshelves, family photos, and the smell of lemon tea. She brought out a thick folder and set it on her dining table. "I've been saving this for 3 years," she said. We sat for hours. Eleanor wasn't just recounting events, she was laying out evidence like a witness on the stand. She had kept every notice, email, and memo from the HOA that had been sent to the Miller family. "The first violation came just 6 weeks after they moved in," she explained, sliding the document toward me. "It was about their fence. The stain color didn't match the HOA's preferred palette. They fixed the fence. A month later, they were cited again, this time for garden border stones that were inconsistent with landscaping guidelines. Each fix brought a new infraction. It was a pattern, a loop of punishment that never ended. Then Eleanor showed me the financial records. Budget line items labeled consulting services, neighborhood assessments, and strategic landscaping evaluations. The amounts were small, but they aligned perfectly with the timeline of the Millers' increasing violations. Always the same vendor, Residential Property Solutions. "They don't just offer advice," Eleanor said. "They help associations optimize their neighborhoods. And sometimes that means forcing out homeowners who don't fit the desired profile." I stared at the records, my stomach in knots. So Nain hired them. To justify pushing the Millers out. Eleanor nodded grimly and handed me one last paper. The property sale record. They sold the house for $43,000 under the assessed value. First offer. They just wanted out. She paused, her voice tightening. The mother told me their teenage daughter stopped going outside. Not because of school bullies, but because HOA inspectors showed up in their yard every week. The father installed security cameras, not for burglars, but to document inspections. I didn't know what to say. The horror wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the slow, systematic erosion of peace. They lost $40,000 just to feel safe again, Eleanor whispered. We sat in silence, the folder between us like a crime scene file. The Miller family wasn't an isolated incident. They were the blueprint. I was simply the next page in the plan. The following morning, I drove to the county courthouse. I spent the day poring over property records and HOA filings. It didn't take long to find confirmation of Eleanor's suspicions. 3 other families. All on or near Maple Street. All sold their homes for well below market value within the past 4 years, after prolonged battles with the HOA. The timelines were nearly identical. Violation notices. Escalating fines. Legal threats. Then, finally, a quiet sale and departure. But what shook me to the core was what I uncovered next. I cross-referenced the dates of the home sales with the HOA's financial reports and vendor payments. In each case, the harassment campaigns had begun shortly after payments to the same consulting company, Residential Property Solutions, had increased. And those payments stopped within 2 weeks of each homeowner's sale. It wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a strategy. These families weren't just victims of overzealous rule enforcement. They were targets of a calculated campaign to drive down property values, seize leverage, and resell homes to more desirable residents. I drove home that evening, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't just in a legal battle anymore. I was caught in a machine, a ruthless, profit-driven system designed to destroy resistance through fear, attrition, and financial ruin. But now, I had the playbook. And I wasn't backing down. The final HOA meeting began just as the others had, at least on the surface. It started with Nain Whitlow doing what she did best, performing. Dressed in a crisp beige blazer and navy blouse, her perfectly coordinated outfit screamed authority without ever needing to raise her voice. She moved through the crowd of neighbors like a seasoned politician, shaking hands, exchanging air kisses, and offering overly familiar greetings that gave the illusion of warmth. To an outsider, she seemed the picture of composed leadership. But I wasn't fooled. Not anymore. Tonight, there was something different behind her practiced smile, a flicker of unease in her eyes that no amount of strategic small talk could completely mask. Her hands, though steady, had a stiffness to them. The muscle along her jaw kept flexing slightly as she nodded through the crowd. She knew, on some level, that something was off. That she didn't quite have control of the evening the way she normally did. That was the first sign. The community center was full, standing room only. Folding chairs lined up in rows were all claimed well before the start of the meeting, with late arrivals lingering along the walls or peeking in through the glass doors from the hallway. The air buzzed with more than just the usual neighborly chatter. There was an energy in the room, a tension that rippled beneath the surface like a taut wire waiting to snap. Eleanor stood beside me near the back of the room, holding one of the presentation folders we'd spent hours perfecting. Her presence grounded me. She gave me a quick squeeze on the shoulder, and I nodded. This was it. No turning back now. Nain called the meeting to order at exactly 6 p.m., tapping the gavel against the small wooden podium with a sharp crack that silenced the room. The effect was immediate, habitual obedience. People stopped their conversations mid-sentence and turned their full attention to her. That alone said everything about the kind of control she'd cultivated over the years. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice smooth and honeyed. "Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know your time is valuable, and it means so much to see such strong participation in our community." She paused, letting the obligatory applause roll over her. It was polite but noticeably thinner than usual. As many of you know, we are here tonight to discuss an ongoing concern regarding a violation of our HOA covenant agreements. It involves an unauthorized modification to a property on Maple Street, specifically, the addition of a hardscape patio that was installed without proper approval. She gestured toward a stack of folders beside her. This has become a pressing matter, not just for the resident in question, but for the long-term aesthetic and financial integrity of our neighborhood. I stood motionless, my expression neutral, even as her words deliberately painted me as some kind of selfish violator threatening the very foundation of our community. This was the routine. She'd done it before, to the Millers, the Harpers, the Patel family. Public shaming disguised as administrative procedure. She continued, outlining what she described as a clear breach of Article 6, citing photos of my brickwork, calling it unharmonious with established design principles. The way she wielded bureaucratic language was impressive, in a sinister kind of way. She spoke with the rhythm of someone reading from scripture, calculated, slow, precise, as if each syllable reinforced her right to rule. She went on for nearly 20 minutes, presenting documents, citing timelines, referencing previous cases of enforcement, and appealing to shared values like community, continuity, and pride of ownership. She framed the issue not as a personal vendetta, but as a noble effort to preserve the beauty and cohesion of the neighborhood. Every time she turned a page, her tone grew more certain. She was attempting to box me in before I could speak. But what she didn't realize was that every claim she made was about to be turned inside out. Her own words, her own documents, were the very tools I would use to dismantle her. Once she concluded her presentation, she turned toward me, expression neutral but eyes cold. "Mason," she said, "would you care to address the board and our neighbors with your perspective?" The floor was mine. I picked up my folder, took a steadying breath, and walked to the front of the room. I paused just long enough to let the silence hang, forcing every eye to stay on me. Nain returned to her seat, folding her hands like a queen watching a peasant approach the throne. "My name is Mason Ward," I began, "and until a few months ago, I believed that this was a neighborhood governed by fairness, transparency, and a shared commitment to community well-being. But over the past few weeks, I've discovered that something very different is happening here, something that goes far beyond patios and property aesthetics." A few heads turned. A murmur passed through the back rows. Good. They were listening. "What I'm about to share with you tonight isn't speculation," I continued. "It's based on financial records, public documents, property sale data, and direct recorded conversations. I spent the last several days investigating what I now believe is a coordinated effort by our HOA leadership to target specific homeowners for financial exploitation." I reached into the folder and held up the first sheet. "This is a list of property sales on Maple Street over the past 4 years, specifically the homes that sold significantly below market value. Every one of those sales happened after extended conflict with the HOA, typically over minor or manufactured covenant violations." I walked slowly across the front of the room, passing out copies to neighbors in the front rows, while Eleanor began handing out more toward the back. "But here's the critical part," I said. "Within 30 days of each of those sales, the HOA received what it described in its own financial reports as special assessment contributions or neighborhood improvement donations. Payments totaling tens of thousands of dollars, paid not by the homeowners who sold, but by the people who purchased those homes." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Now we were past curiosity. Now it was anger. I found records showing these payments funded projects that disproportionately enhanced the property values of homes owned by longtime HOA members, including several that directly benefit President Whitlow. Nain's smile had disappeared completely. "But it doesn't stop there," I said. "When I met with President Whitlow earlier today, under the pretense of a resolution meeting, she spoke candidly about the need to remove families who don't match the aesthetic vision of the community. She referred to the Millers' departure as an opportunity and described the HOA's actions as part of a broader effort to optimize property value through committed ownership." A neighbor in the front row turned to whisper something, visibly upset. I saw Mr. Patel clench his jaw. "But the final piece," I said, "is this." I held up a printed excerpt from the HOA bylaws, Section 12. This section clearly states that any property modifications not involving a roof structure are explicitly exempt from requiring HOA approval. My patio? Legal. Fully compliant. And Nain Whitlow knew it when she filed that lawsuit. Now the crowd erupted. Gasps, questions, accusations. Nain tried to speak, but the noise drowned her out. "And yes," I said, raising my voice above the noise, "I recorded our conversation today, legally. And I've already submitted that recording, along with all these documents, to the county clerk, to the office of the state HOA Oversight Committee, and to the local news." I turned to Nain, locking eyes with her for the first time since I'd started speaking. "This isn't just about a patio. It's about integrity, about leadership, and about every family who has been pushed out of this neighborhood under false pretenses." I stepped back from the podium, heart hammering, hands shaking slightly. But I'd done it. I'd said everything. For a moment, the room was frozen. Then a voice from the middle row said exactly what everyone else was thinking. It's time for her to resign. 4 years, Nain Whitlow had wielded bureaucracy like a sword, and this night, she came armed for battle. Charts, reports, forms, she had turned paperwork into a fortress, each document another brick in a wall meant to intimidate and obscure. She stood at the front of the community center, confident and composed, surrounded by towering easels displaying colorful graphs and laminated photographs. There were spreadsheets projecting property values, legal memos from Henderson and Associates about covenant consistency, and photos of distant neighborhoods that had collapsed due to alleged aesthetic laxity. She had even highlighted segments of the HOA bylaws with color-coded tabs. Her presentation, polished to corporate perfection, was designed to portray my brick driveway as a threat to Maple Street's delicate harmony. She spoke for over 20 minutes with the air of someone who expected applause at the end. Her words were heavy with implication, that without her leadership, the neighborhood would spiral into decline. She used phrases like property value risk exposure and precedent of noncompliance. She warned that if the HOA didn't act decisively, Maple Street would become unrecognizable within 5 years. When she finally concluded, she opened the floor for discussion. You could see it in her eyes, she was expecting the usual nods of agreement and polite affirmations from longtime residents. And at first, it seemed like she might get them. Mrs. Patterson, in her usual powder blue cardigan, raised her hand and expressed concern that inconsistent enforcement might lead to a slippery slope where anything goes. Mr. Williams praised Nain for her diligence and said that the community needed to reaffirm its commitment to uniform standards. Then I stood. I didn't bring a single chart. No PowerPoint slides. Just a binder and a printed copy of our HOA's Covenant Handbook. Section 12, I said calmly, holding up the book so everyone could see it. Let me read it to you, word for word. My voice echoed clearly across the room. I didn't need to raise it. The silence was absolute. As I read aloud the clause that specifically exempted patios and driveway surfacing from requiring prior HOA approval, provided the material used was consistent with the original structure, eyes began to widen. I didn't look at Nain. I didn't need to. I watched the crowd instead, their faces shifting from passive listening to dawning realization. I could almost see the dominoes falling in their minds. When I finished, I closed the book gently and added, according to our own rules, the ones we've all agreed to, the modification I made to my driveway was entirely legal. It did not, and never did, require HOA approval. There was a ripple of murmurs. People shifted in their seats. And yet, I continued, opening my binder, I've been threatened with fines, legal action, and removal of my property enhancement under the claim of noncompliance. Why? I walked to the table and placed down a printed timeline, each event marked clearly. The day I submitted a courtesy notice, even though I didn't have to, the day Nain responded with a violation warning, the beginning of strange letters in my mailbox, and the exact day a consulting payment was made from HOA funds to a third-party enforcement firm. What you're seeing here, I told the room, flipping to a second timeline, is not a random mistake or a difference in interpretation. It's a pattern. I presented financial records showing a correlation between harassment campaigns and sales of homes below market value. One family. Then another. Then a third. Each time, escalating enforcement, unexplained fines, a sudden drop in property value, and then, conveniently, a buyer who happened to be connected to long-standing HOA board members. People were no longer just murmuring. They were whispering to each other, sharing glances of concern. And then came the moment that changed everything. I'd like to share a brief audio recording, I said, setting a portable speaker on the podium. Nain's voice filled the room. Calm. Confident. Chilling. Sometimes pushing someone to leave, she said, is the best thing for the community. The room froze. When the recording reached her comment about how the Miller family's departure had created an opportunity to attract residents more committed to our vision, you could hear the weight of her words settle over the audience like a lead blanket. One woman gasped. Someone else whispered, unbelievable. Nain tried to recover quickly. That recording was made without my knowledge or consent, she snapped, her tone suddenly brittle. It's an invasion of privacy and a manipulation of my words. She looked around for support, but it wasn't there anymore. He's twisted this to serve a personal vendetta, she continued, desperate now. This is a witch hunt. But before she could say more, Eleanor stood up. She didn't need to shout. Her voice was steady, clear, commanding in its calm. I've been documenting your actions for 3 years, Nain, she said. And I have evidence to support everything Mason just presented, plus more. Eleanor walked to the front and placed a thick folder beside mine. She was composed and dignified, the perfect contrast to Nain's unraveling composure. Her presentation was quiet but devastating. Photos of the Miller property, which had been accused of landscaping violations, showed pristine lawns and professionally trimmed hedges. Copies of HOA violation notices were contrasted with dated photographs proving the alleged infractions were fabricated. I also have records for the Jacksons and the Reeds, Eleanor continued, flipping pages. Both families received repeated, baseless violations. Both sold their homes below market value after months of harassment. And both buyers were connected, directly or indirectly, to members of the enforcement committee. The room erupted. Angry voices filled the air as neighbors began to connect the dots, stories they'd heard, rumors they'd dismissed, and behaviors they'd ignored. A man near the back said aloud what many were thinking, "This has been going on for years." Nain tried to interject, but her voice was drowned out. Someone called for a vote of no confidence. It was seconded before the echo of the first voice had even faded. The vote passed by an overwhelming margin. Just like that, with the raising of hands and a trembling gavel, Nain Whitlow was no longer the president of the Maple Street Homeowners Association. In the aftermath, the group moved quickly. All pending legal actions against residents were suspended. A committee was formed to review HOA finances over the past 4 years. They planned to bring in auditors, potentially law enforcement, to investigate the misuse of community funds and possible fraud. Neighbors came up to me, shaking my hand, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Some admitted they had been too afraid to challenge her authority. Others thanked Eleanor, asking how they could help rebuild the integrity of their community. As I drove home that night, there was no feeling of triumph. What I felt was deeper, relief, maybe, or the quiet satisfaction that comes with standing up for something true. My driveway, the spark that had ignited the battle, gleamed under the streetlights. The herringbone brick pattern had never looked more beautiful. But more than that, it was now officially uncontested and entirely legal. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee on the same brick patio that had once been deemed non-compliant, I saw a new sign in Nain's front yard, "For sale." Apparently, Maple Street no longer aligned with her community vision. Across the street, Eleanor was tending to her garden. She looked up, saw me, and waved. "Justice does taste better than revenge, doesn't it, Mason?" she called out with a knowing smile. I smiled back. Not because I had won. But because, finally, the truth had been heard, and this time, it had spoken loud enough for everyone to listen. The end.